What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown, and you're tuned into season 2, episode 11 of The Last Hope Intellectual. All right, y'all. So we have such an interesting shoot the shit today that we're calling No More Holi-deification. But before we do that, let's shout out our very many patrons. So thank y'all.
Yes, we got a buttload of so we're gonna run down this list. We have Brandon Crittenden, Sam Jackson, S. Scott Anderson, Joshua Chacon, Taylor, Jack Stevens, Michael Holt, Timothy Ryan. A special shout out to Mama Burden, Elizabeth Burden, mama of our co-host over there.
The birth of a legend, the one who birthed the legend that is CBS. Period. Shout out.
Adam Bachrock, Marion Anderson, Deb Springer. Shout out to Deb.
What up,
Mahir
Deb?
Joshi, Darren Utley, Charles Holmes, Zach Kerner, and Khalil. Thank you all for your support and continuing to help us pay our producer.
Yes, and what up, Mahir? What up, Charles? 2 more homies. So y'all showed up and showed out. We really, really, really appreciate it. But on to our discussion. Okay, so 2 Black, you really came up with this idea in terms of the pitfalls of all of these holidays built around the people that we want to remember, or really at what it comes down to, the people who are worthy of like commemorating or celebrating. And so do you want to kind of explain where your head was at?
I mean, we were first, if y'all don't mind me giving a little, back behind the scenes, but we were talking about we were just talking through how to talk about this for Dr. King, because we knew we wanted to do some type of episode in relation to it. I think we were talking about how typically people within our world like to talk about how Dr. King was radical and he's not the watered down person that he's made out to be, which is true, right? Nobody's denying that, but I don't think anybody that watches our show is confused about that. I think that part is pretty clear. So we were just shooting the shit about different ideas. And I think somehow holidays came up and I was just like, how about we just don't do that anymore? So, because I mean, I'm not knocking people who wanted to have that day, but I think part of how we get to the conversation of King's more radical than they give him credit for is because of holidays and those type of things. I think that it creates this, in order for something to be a holiday, they have to create a national sentiment, and that inevitably is going to lead to it being watered down when it's in a country like America. Now, if this was in somewhere else where, this was like post-revolution or something, and we were honoring a comrade who had died in the struggle, I think that would make sense. But to have a holiday in the belly of the beast during really what is another form of counter-revolution since he's passed, when they really watered it down. And I was just looking up earlier when they were talking about creating a holiday for him, and it was funny that they, like Jesse Helms, a senator at the time, was saying he didn't want King to have a holiday because he was a communist, because he said he had Marxist something. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something. But basically, he said he espoused Marxism, and now the very things that King was accused for being as to why he couldn't have a holiday has been stripped from who he is. And he never officially came to be a communist, but he clearly espoused a lot of Marxist rhetoric and was influenced by that. But all of that gets pulled away. And I think part of that is just holidays. It's just the way of the nature that works. So I don't think continuing to put people on holidays and creating these kind of like statues out of folks, I think that just deifies them, and it creates a distance from who they are, and it doesn't allow us to engage with the actual struggles that they came from.
Well, to Claire, okay, so in Why We Can't Wait, he says that he's not a Marxist. He said he's read Capital, and but that he's not a Marxist. He doesn't believe in communism. he believes that there's a third way between like exploitative capitalism and communism. But I will say, and I posted about this on Twitter, he was against anti-communism because he saw the way that it was weaponized like systematically against people like him who were who are really just struggling to hold the United States up to its ideals, right? At the very least. And even those people were painted as communists, as you pointed out. And so I don't, that relates to sort of what I wanted to say about this in terms of, I think both the right and the left can have a propensity to try to shoehorn King into some type of ideology. Like on the one hand, they make him, like this the right will make him this milk toast, like post-racial, whatever. But on the other hand, the left will try to make the man into Harry Haywood. And it's like, he wasn't that either. He was maybe some type of social democrat. He was against exploitation and oppression, but there's many sort of articulations of that. Just like all historical materialism is not Marxist, like all anti-capitalism isn't like communism, overthrow the government. You know what I mean? And so like, he wasn't really about that action. And I think that's fine. And if people actually took King seriously as a thinker, as opposed to some deified leader or some abstract symbol of what could be, then we would be more clear about where he stands. And so this idea of no more Holi-deification is just that. It's like, what that tends to do is abstract the individual or even whatever event we're commemorating from its content and just make it into it turns it into like symbolism or something that's sort of devoid of content. And so like, I saw there was a tweet that says something along the lines of, all of a sudden MLK Day has become a day of service. And although King was like a servant leader, he was about like, run us these rights, you know what I'm saying? And so it wasn't just about, some sort of, again, some day of service and of commemorating how we need to give back to each other. That's part of it, I guess. But like, King was in them streets, organizing and marching and protesting, engaging in direct action, going to jail and all of those things. And that's not, now it's kind of like a parade where we go and we ain't got to work, which I'm down with that because King was for the workers, but I'm down with Ava to work. But it gets these holidays hollow. They become hollow days. They hollow all the meaning out of shit. So anyway.
No, I mean, I think you made the point about King in particular as a figure. In terms of the broader phenomenon of Holi-deification, I do think the distinction that you made between what that looks like in a place like the US that actually doesn't support political education, that doesn't attempt to actually create a population of people who think critically about what their history has been and what the future might be. So much of, I think, what you talked about, CBS, in terms of even the left trying to take up King in a certain way, like you said, it is a response to that, right? It is an attempt to push back against this sort of liberalizing, kind of whitewashing vision of who King was. But I do think, and I think there is an issue with sort of Holi-deification in general, right? Because when we are talking about these kind of collective struggles that have happened over time that many people have contributed to, and we boil them down to these particular sort of these deified figures, then we do lose a lot of the complexities of what those things are. But I think about, so like I'm thinking just recently, Guinea celebrated Sekou Touré Day, and they have been they've decided to make Sekou Touré Day a year-long thing. Coming up in February, the PAC in South Africa will be celebrating Robert Sobukwe Day, right? And so in a lot of ways, in the context of Guinea, even though Sekou Touré was the first independent president of the country of Guinea-Conakry, after his overthrow, his legacy was very much sanitized, right? And so part of the Sekou Touré Day is about bringing that legacy back to light, right? In the case of the PAC, in the case of South Africa, Robert Sobukwe's image has been largely sort of erased in the face of the particular history of Nelson Mandela and the ANC, right? And I'm not necessarily attributing that to Nelson Mandela, but that's what the history of the country has done, right? And so I do think that there is something to be gotten out of these holidays that attempt to use a person's life as an excuse to have a broader conversation. But I think that that only makes sense when when that's what we actually do, is that when we use that as an opportunity to remember all of the complexities of the type of work that they were doing, and not just, as we're talking about here, and not just this sort of deification of these individual charismatic personas. I think that that is at the heart of what I think the critique of no more holi-deification is about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm probably of the unpopular opinion. I don't think we need no commemoration or I'm against all monuments, right? And this is not to say we don't remember people in all sorts of ways, or remember organizations or movements in all sorts of ways. But I just feel like ultimately, when there's a day dedicated to somebody, it just lends to hagiography ultimately. And I just don't, I don't know. I understand, like, and I think that I also take the point that both you, Layla, and Two Black made about in a post-revolutionary situation. But even then, it's just I don't know. I could do with or without them, but like I think there's a lot of energy that goes into like the struggles, the monument battles, right? Or even all of the struggle that went into having it MLK Day. I'm from Arizona. I don't think it really became a law until maybe, or it became an official holiday to like 1993, like very comparatively late to other places. I think it was the last place in the country.
Public Enemy made a whole song about that. So,
yeah. Yeah, and they only did it so they could get the Super Bowl. And so I feel like so much energy goes around organizing around these symbolic things that to me that energy could go elsewhere, notwithstanding the fact that a lot of people's consciousness, it can be raised through struggles over any number of things. But I'm not with the commemorations and monumentalization. It's just not my personal bag. So
yeah, I mean, to clarify earlier, I wasn't saying he was a Marxist. I guess I was saying he was within the spectrum of what we call the left, and I was speaking loosely. So it's like, but even that, whatever that relationship is that he has to those ideas, and like you said, historical materialism isn't solely defined by Marxism. But because in that book that we'll talk about later, he talks about how you have the conditions inform the situation, and that's very much aligned with the type of Marxist rhetoric, historical materialism. But again, to have a holiday that is happening while they're literally like trying to tear back the achievements that not only himself but the entire movement accomplished, and to still have this holiday, and then now it's being used to leverage for voting rights, and Biden and Kamala Harris are out there trying to do that, and even the moderate Negroes aren't showing up to support them for that. It actually becomes usurped and becomes a tool to like re-educate people about something that didn't even really happen. Like, it actually, as much as we struggle for something like this, and when you're doing it, particularly in the belly of the beast, it's a way to erase history. Like, I think you can make an argument that the holiday has been worse than better for Dr. King, as far as like how we've come to understand him, because I honestly prefer the Dr. King that they didn't think deserved the holiday because he was too radical. Like, I would prefer that Dr. King over the Dr. King that they've completely like stripped of it. And so I think in general, giving holidays when you're still fighting, I don't think that helps, and I don't know what we ultimately seek to gain from it other than symbolism. And symbolism is okay in some cases, but as we know, again, within America, like symbolism, when you're talking about like CBS, when you're talking about statues and monuments and stuff, symbolism is a way that we get played, and holidays is one of the best ways of doing that. So it's not just Dr. King, but in any of the ways that holidays happen, even when it's something like a Black History Month, which has good origins, but I'm saying like now that gets played out as just Black Jeopardy, Black History flashcards, like just random facts. I'm at McDonald's and they're telling me the first Negro to make a French fry or whatever the fuck. Like, it's just random shit, so that has no context to it. And it completely strips it from the conditions that it came from. So that's why it's like, Holi-deification, or any of these celebratory meanings that don't critically engage our history is just miseducating us. There's no critical engagement with it. And that's my real criticism, is that it actually snatches away critical engagement. It just becomes celebration in a very non-critical way.
If you working for the
So-
tater tot lobby, just say that. Like, you came at fries real hard. But if you a totist, just say that. Don't like try to make
Wow.
it political. I just wanted to say that.
Wow.
Okay.
You the first
So
Negro to
I
make
am-
fries.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
I have a different opinion about this than I think both of you, and definitely different than Sharice, because I think we are using the occasion of King to have this conversation, to have a critical conversation about King. And granted, we can do this at any time, and we will likely have some other conversations that will relate to this conversation, that will do this type of work, and that this is what we've dedicated ourselves to doing. But for most people, neither school nor home is a place where they get even introduced in even the most superficial ways to any of these topics. And so having these days is an excuse to begin that conversation. And so for me, as a person who thinks about, my own identity, I do think teaching is central to how I see myself. Being a teacher is central to how I see myself. And I do think that many of these occasions offer opportunities to teach things that are not otherwise taught, to engage critical conversations that are not otherwise had. And in a perfect world where we were able to have intellectually rigorous, thoughtful debates about all of the complexities of life and history, we wouldn't need a day. But that's not the world that we live in. And so for me, and that's the same, and I feel this same way even about sort of some of the pop culture phenomena like Blood Diamonds. Blood Diamonds is a movie, is a very,
Not a good movie.
It talks. It's not a good movie, but what it does is it introduces people to the particular phenomenon of war over minerals in Sierra Leone, which for a lot of people, not all of them, will then precipitate them asking more questions. And so that's what I see these as opportunities to do. And the truth is, no matter what we put out there, whoever wants to use our shit against us, they're going to do it however, no matter how clearly we state it, no matter how clearly we write it, no matter how eloquently we do it, there's going to attempt to do that. We don't have any control over what they attempt to do with that, but we do have control over the way we continue to try to have a conversation that shapes things the way we understand. And I think that that's our responsibility to do. And so for me, that's what I see. And I don't necessarily think that holidays and monuments are the only ways to do that, but they are one of the ways to do that. And so for me, I do think there's purchase in them.
Yeah. Disagree. I mean, I just feel like, for me, just like, yes, these can be days to teach, but the reality of the current situation is that, number one, we're not even in school. So there's that part. And secondly, and I know you're talking about alternative education, but secondly, people kicking it today. It has become a day of sort of leisure, and some people might be doing like going and picking up trash in the neighborhood or whatever. Like, it becomes like a service thing, but like, it's often not taken up as a teaching day. And yes, we are using Martin Luther King Day as a time to talk about, to have this particular King focused episode. We did an episode last week about class struggle, or like a couple weeks ago about, class suicide, just because. So I don't think and the birthdays and the dates of events are going to pass anyway. And there'll always be opportunities without becoming holidays. And so I think the conflation of the event or the birthday or the ability to commemorate with holidays or monuments, I just feel I personally don't think it's necessary. But as you said, those are sort of maybe two different sides of the argument. But again, I will say, and this is not to trivialize King or whatever, like, I'm glad we have a day off. Like, I, as a worker and as someone who supports workers, I'm glad that there is a day to like not be grinding all the time. You know what I mean? And so I do think that that's of all of that, I'm glad that there's a day off. Although we could just have days off that are not attached to shit, that are attached to the fact that we work ourselves to death in this country. And so there should be paid days off anyway. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with that there's upside. I mean, again, if everything has its own contradictions, so of course there's like things that we can utilize. I mean, I think I just pulled up a quote. Walter Rodney said, this was in Russian Revolution. It is a basic principle of revolution that one utilizes and exploits the contradictions among the enemy. So of course you use a holiday that we did fight for to as a means of teaching or of trying to raise consciousness. But I guess what I'm pointing to is still the nature of capitalism, and still the nature of, you know, how this works. And I think that's often that even in our struggle to do that, what we're trying to teach, that's at the same time it's being used to water down, you know, whatever we're trying to teach, and they have the upper hand because they're the ones in power, and often many of us are not educated in a format to where even when we have the opportunity, that we're able to really tell anybody anything about Dr. King, because we really are just following the line. I think about here in Indiana, and I know in a lot of other states, they're passing these critical race theory laws, and they're talking about, you know, you can't be made to feel uncomfortable and all of that. And I know a lot of people are mad. And I was saying to somebody, I was like, if you actually read the bill, it sounds pretty much like the same anti-communist, you know, bullshit Black history that we already grew up with. They're just formalizing it into the record. So because most of the schools don't teach anything anyway. Like that's the way that we're politicized. And I think one time, I don't think I was on this episode. I think y'all did an episode, y'all were talking about critical race theory, and I believe Dr. Layla, I believe you said something like, you don't think most of these people could even teach critical race theory if they were allowed to. You know, most of the teachers, like, they don't have the skill sets to do so. So what we're dealing with overall is a situation, because those people don't have the skills, people are just going to get the Martin and Me film of Dr. King. I don't know if anybody ever had to suffer through that as a kid. It's a cartoon of Dr. King and a white boy going back in time. It's bad. Don't ever watch it. But that's what they're getting. So I just think, by and large, like, I'm just saying that's how the system works. So we can always exploit loopholes. We can always exploit things as an opportunity, but we're exploiting it against what the natural progression of that system is.
The only response I have to that, and I think this is my broader point, is that all of that other shit is always happening anyway.
Mm.
All of it, like all of the obfuscation, all of the misappropriation, all of the silencing, all of that other shit is always happening anyway, right? And so we take whatever opportunities we have to counter that narrative. And that can be on the occasion of a birth, a death, a special day, or whatever. That can be any other time. But we know how information flows and moves. And so that's my only thing. Like, all of the other shit that we're always constantly pushing back against is happening every day, every minute, every second anyway, right? Even this as a podcast is a drop in the bucket of all of the noise, of all the other shit that's happening all the time. We have a particular kind of audience, and it's growing little by little, but I think there's still something to what even we're doing in having these conversations. Even if our regular Friday night audience is 50 people and our regular viewing is about 1,000, like, whatever it is, it's still something. And I think it's still worth the effort.
Yeah, I would just lastly, I think at least the lesson I learned from this is, like, or I take from this, I should say, is, we just have to recognize the contradictions as they are. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be, depending on how you see it. But I'm just saying, like, the contradictions are what they are. So yes, there are opportunities, but at the same time, the state is going to be the state. Capitalism is going to be capitalism, and that is going to create a struggle, and that's the struggle that we're already in.
CBS Day, May 16th, 2021. Run it.
Contradictions.
And scene.
right, y'all. So for our first planting thoughts of 2022, we have the Dracaena compacta. This is a smaller version of the plant. This plant is quite slow growing, although it can get up to about 6 feet. It's native to Central and Southeast Africa, not Asia, sorry. It's one of those plants that a lot of people like to prune it to keep it small. It does relatively well in shady areas. But one of the things that's really nice about this plant is that it will continue to branch anywhere you cut a branch, anywhere you prune it at a branch. And so that makes it a plant that you can really shape in terms of what it looks like. And so for me, I think this plant just helps me think a lot about thinking ahead in the future. You don't get to see a lot of quick, rapid response or growth from this particular plant, but if you have a vision for what you want it to look like, you can get it there eventually. So that is this week's plant of the day, the Dracaena compacta.
All right, y'all. So if you have not caught on already, this episode is built around taking the Martin Luther King holiday as a chance to speak about King and his legacy and sort of all of the other conversations that opens up, which is really important. So for this history of the present, I'm going to read a couple of quotes from this book, Why We Can't Wait, and we just going to chop it up and talk about it. So the first quote is, and then, okay, Why We Can't Wait is from 1963. So he said, quote, "A methodology and philosophy of revolution is neither born nor accepted overnight. From the moment it emerges, it is subjected to rigorous tests, opposition, scorn, and prejudice. The old guard in any society resents new methods, for old guards wear the decorations and medals won by waging battle in the accepted manner. Often opposition comes not only from the conservatives who cling to tradition, but also from the extremist militants who favor neither the old nor the new." So I just thought that was bars. Like I thought that was a really sort of a really juicy quote that actually also pertains to what's going on today, right? It just seems like a truism, right? That what he's describing is actually like an age-old thing, and we see it not least going back to like the explosion of Black Lives Matter in 2014 and 2016, and then coming back in a real way in 2020. And so I just wonder, so part of what I wanted to think about is what is the status quo, or what is like what's being clung to today by the conservatives, the white ones, but also the Black ones, right? Because we know these whites can't get right, but like even the black conservatives, like the niggerati, like what are the truths, or what are the sort of medals that they're rocking today that a new generation or like a different class of militants is pushing back against?
No, because I think there's so many things, right? Because I think one of the things is the biggest lie about what this country is, that you can work hard and achieve your dreams, right? Like this myth of meritocracy, if you shut up and keep your head down and you just keep pressing forward, like life will improve. And again, like you said, it's this linear progress narrative, which is just not true, right? And I think that what is actually happening by and large is that even people that don't necessarily have a revolutionary consciousness recognize that this shit is like, we being sold some bullshit. Like this shit is expired goods. Like we're gonna get sick if we keep eating this shit. And I don't think people even necessarily know what to do otherwise, but people just know that this ain't it. And so I feel like a part of what the status quo that's being held on to is like people want to go back to a time where people believed in what the American dream was. Like that they could keep selling that shit to people, and that they could keep convincing people to, pour all their money into debt that they ain't gonna never be able to pay back. Because even that, like even the way people are questioning, and I'm not talking about education in a general sense, but even the way people are challenging what it means to go to college, to pay for an education, to go into debt, to pay for an education, to live a life where you ain't gonna never be able to pay that shit off, right? It's not the same thing as attempting to educate yourself in any kind of way. But even that is a is a lie that people are letting go. People like, fuck that. Like, I don't gotta do that shit no more. Like, I'm not gonna keep buying into this shit. So, I mean, I think there are just so many fundamental myths about what America is that are being undone at the moment. Those are precisely the things that conservatives are holding on to, that they want people to continue to believe in this shit because the belief is what keeps it strong. Like all these other things, like, you know, people are begrudgingly doing shit, you know, if their resentment is building, all that shit is fuel for a revolution. But as long as people believe the lie that you know, if you work hard, you do it, you can have a house, you can have a family, you can do this, you can live, you can die a certain way, you can live with dignity, and people are not going to push back. And so I think that that's the kind of fundamental thing that's being clung to at the moment by conservatives and liberals alike.
Yeah, I guess even when I read that quote, when he says conservatives, and I try to read a little bit more, but I don't even think about it as just conservatives in maybe the way it gets described in popular media, like right, left, or
Right.
Democrat, Republican. I think conservatives, 'cause I mean the word itself is like trying to conserve a particular like way of life, right? You know,
Committed to the tradition or the status quo.
right. So that changes depending on the context. So I think we have plenty of conservatives, regardless of what they might claim politically speaking, whether they're Democrat, whatever. Like they're conservatives in the sense that they want to hold on to, like you said, a particular guard, a particular way of life. And then anything that pushes back against that, they have a problem with. So I think the civil rights establishment, you know, that Malcolm, you know, called the Big Six, which hopefully we get to some of that, but like that establishment and just trying to hold on to the nostalgia of themselves, and everybody saying that they touched King's garment or whatever, and using that as a means to justify whatever they do. I think that old establishment of like even the voting rights thing, like I I I would almost argue some of them I think are gleeful that now they get to relive that fight, even though people are losing their rights because they get to become relevant again. And that is their way of dealing with anything. It's through the courts, right? It's through becoming friends with the administration and buddying up with them and going out and whipping the vote for Black people and telling them, if you don't vote for these people, you're gonna, you know, we're gonna go to fascism and the world's gonna end. And like I think that is like a very much, you know, in line also with what Layla was saying, like they're still believing in this American dream, still believing that this somehow can be reformed or resuscitated, and whipping Black people and anyone else, you know, within that line. And if you don't hold that line, like they come for you. And you see that not only among just the old civil rights guard, as far as like an older generation, but you see that even among some of these people around our age who are now getting TV jobs and, you know, now getting the book deals that get them in them spaces. And now you see folks who used to be a little bit more militant, like Dr. King said, of being flipped to that narrative because there's money attached to that. There's a status attached to that. So the conservatives not only like are trying to hold on to an old guard, but they also try to reproduce themselves through younger people, you know, by offering them status and things of that nature. I think we're still dealing with that now. So anyone who presents any alternative route, even if it's something just as moderate as like voting for Bernie Sanders, you know, even if it's something as moderate as that, let alone anything much more radical, is often shut down as being unrealistic, as being someone who can't wait. Ironically, you know, to Dr. King's point, because you know this comes out of the whole letter from the Birmingham jail and all of that. Like this comes and him talking about the white moderate, but I think we should really talk about not just white moderates, but there are, you know, quote unquote Black moderates or these Black conservatives. You know, and there's a lot of the people that put him up and use him as a way to get speaking gigs and everything else are the same white moderates he's talking about. In many ways worse, you know.
Yeah, there's just so much to say. So the part where he talked about you know, the methodology of philosophy being subjected to rigorous tests and opposition and prejudice, it reminds me of so bad faith in the philosophical sense has to do with like the demand for perfect evidence for something to be validated. And so any deviation from the perfect evidence that's demanded automatically renders a thing not usable or irrelevant or dangerous. And so what that reminds me of is like, you know, for example, how the way that people talk about socialism, right? That they point to all of the sort of contradictions or the atrocities or whatever that were committed under Stalin, for example. But number one, ignore all of the, all of the progress and all of the human betterment, but also don't hold the US and capitalism to those same rigorous standards. And so this sort of like demand for perfect evidence when it comes to new sort of philosophies or methodologies of struggle, I think is like really important. And socialism is comparatively new as a global social system, right? In its sort of iteration through, not in its practice and its means of organizing society, like over the long arc of time, but as a sort of global challenger to capitalism, right? So that was the first thing that was kind of like apropos of nothing. But secondly, just what really stood out to me was when he said they wear the decorations and medals won by waging battle in the accepted manner, right? And that really reminded me of like 2020 when there was all of this, critique of people who were like burning shit down, right? And all of the property damage and destruction. There was such a demand to like protest and to organize and to assert oneself in a particular way to be seen as valid or legitimate, which is old as fuck, but it reasserted itself in such stunning fashion. Even with like the looting, people was really mad like it was their shit. Like, you want to go have that Louis Vuitton anyway, sis? Why is you mad? Like, that's not yours, and they have insurance. They're fine. Like, but people were really up in arms about shit like that, right? Because it is, as you were saying, to like, it is an affront to their leadership or their ability to codify how it is that we achieve liberation, or how it, and not only that, what counts as liberation and what counts as crime, right? What counts as freedom and what counts as chaos or disorder or rioting. And the other thing that I wanted to comment on that was mentioned is this voting rights, because even in, I can't remember, no, it obviously wasn't in this piece, but like King later on, I want to say by 67, was like, those Voting Rights Act weren't enough, right? The Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Act weren't enough because the ghettos, right, are still underdeveloped, underserved. The material conditions have not changed at all. So it's also like people have a fucking historical amnesia. Even King himself, who they try to reduce only to the Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Act, even himself was like, this legislative shit ain't enough. And then in our current moment, what happens is it's not even as if people are propping up like the voting rights stuff as a means for material betterment. It's simply they're taking away your vote, and therefore they're taking away your voice. Never mind the fact that this administration has been utterly unresponsive to any of the material demands, not even to the shit they said they were going to do. It's simply about getting the vote. It's like it's an anachronism. And again, if King is your model, even he was able to look back and be like, this ain't it, right? So
yeah, I believe that was in the Other America speech that you're talking about, and he talks about like,
it's more difficult today because we are struggling now for genuine equality. And it's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee a livable income and a good, solid job. It's much easier to guarantee the right to vote than it is to guarantee the right to live in sanitary, decent housing conditions. It is much easier to integrate a public park than it is to make genuine, quality, integrated education a reality. And so today we are struggling for something which says we demand genuine equality. It's not merely a struggle against extremist behavior toward Negroes.
Again, he was I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I'm just saying, like, he was abandoned later on in his life by the many people now, the same kind of guard that likes to lift him up and hustle, race hustle off of him. He was abandoned by these people by going too far and basically fumbling their bag. That's really how they felt about it. So when they come out now with their, like Dr. King stood for this and that, like, a lot of y'all would left him out to dry, and you would do the same thing today. So that's what I'm saying. Like that guard, I just don't think that guard can necessarily be trusted. I'm not saying there aren't decent people within it, but as a group, I don't know.
Yeah. So the other thing that I was thinking about is like, who do y'all think who are the people today that favor neither the old nor the new? Like, I think that that's really interesting. And it reminds me of that quote. I want to say it's Gramsci, where it's like, the old is dead, the new has not been born. And now the new has not yet been born. Now is the time of monsters. And he's referring to like the interregnum. So like that period in between the death of the old and the new not being yet born.
Asking who, like, as a group, a person,
who might be the entity that would represent what King is talking about. So he called them extremist militants who are against both the old and the new. But who are these people?
When I think about new, you said as you just cited Gramsci, like it's something that's not yet become, right? So I'm trying to think about who favored neither the old nor the new.
Well, the way that King, so my sense of things, right? The way that King is setting this up is that if it is that the extremist militants are against the old and the new, it seems to me that he's saying the people who are against sort of like conciliation, but also people who are against the tactics that are emerging at that time, i.e., direct action, which is not new, by the way. It's only new if you don't pay attention to what the communists were doing, but I digress.
Yeah, and he goes on to criticize the critics of direct action in that. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, and so we'll get to that in a second. But to me, I guess it's confusing to me as well, simply because it's kind of like, who is the reason why people are against the new is because the new is still inscribed in the old shit. You know what I mean? It's not because they're against newness or progress or, or what is to come, but rather what's being codified as the new ain't enough, And so I don't know if, so that's just kind of, so I was like, I don't really know.
No, that makes more sense when you put it that way. I think I was thinking about it differently. Go ahead.
I'm also wondering if there's like a couched critique in King's quote about who the new is.
Yeah.
Oh, let me just get to that.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I'm also thinking for King at the time that he was like, King was left of center, but not revolutionary. Like not necessarily the furthest out there, the furthest left. And so, even the ways that he was pushed by the SNCC, the way that he was pushed by, other young people around and say, like, some of this shit that you want to rock, like, we ain't rocking with this no more, right? And like, we have even a different vision even than what you have, right? And so part of that, even the labeling of extremist militants has its own, it has its own underlying sort of types of biases, which I think are speaking to his particular predicament, right? And there's something about the urgency that he's trying to convey, but then there's also a degree of conservatism in even the urgency because his argument is there's still a certain way we have to do things, and that if you think about the sort of general theories of revolution, is that like shit got to be completely undone to be built anew. And attempting to still hold on to certain remnants of things, even as you're trying to move into something new, is kind of where King was in a lot of ways, right? And so, like, I don't know, I'm thinking through all of these things at the moment.
But to a certain degree, King is right. People who are ready for revolution are extremists in this country, period. They are the militants in this country. And this is 1963. This is when COINTELPRO is popping off. He doesn't know this for sure, but this is McCarthyism. This is like, and so I think that his what we might describe, maybe his pragmatism or his caution is probably correctly placed. Cause like if every single Black person in the country took up arms, number one, we're in the US context, we're the numerical minority. And at that moment, the internationalism that we had built up over time was under attack on the one hand, and was it as strong as we thought it was, right? And so I think that he's right to call them extremists. I think the problem is the demonization of extremism, or the criminalization of extremism, because it is the extremists who push everything forward. The motherfucking moderates and the right wouldn't have shit to co-opt without the extremists. So, but let me just read this little part so we can know who King is talking about. Okay, so he said, many of these extremists misread the significance and intent of nonviolence because they fail to perceive that militancy is also the father of the nonviolent way. Angry exhortation from street corners and stirring calls for the Negro to arm and go forth to do battle simulate loud applause. But when the applause dies, the stirred and the stirring return to their homes and lie in their beds for still one more night with no progress in view. They cannot solve the problem they face because they have offered no challenge, but only a call to arms, which they themselves are unwilling to lead, knowing that doom would be its reward. They cannot solve the problem because they seek to overcome a negative situation with negative means. They cannot solve the problem because they did not reach and move into sustained action the large groups of people necessary to attract attention and convey the determination of the majority. The conservatives who say, let us not move so fast, and the extremists who say, let us go out and whip the world, will tell you that they are as far apart as the poles, but there is a striking parallel. They accomplish nothing, for they do not reach the people who have a crying need to be free. What y'all think about that?
Oh, I mean, again, like when people, I got a few things on that, and on that book in general, like a few things, like when people say that Dr. King was like, you know, he never spoke against anybody. He was like, you know, always cordial. Like this is the shit that, you know, I always point to. Like he got his shit in without naming names. Other people just said his name, you know. so this is clearly like not only a shot at Malcolm as an individual, but this is clearly a shot at that side of the fence, at wherever you think they're located. You know, this is a shot at even some of the members in SNCC, who I'm sure was getting on his nerves. And again, this is 1963. So this is the year, this was written before, this book comes out in 64, but what was written here was in 63. This is the year of the March on Washington. This is also the year where the 4 little girls got killed in the church. They got bombed in the church. This came out before both of those events as well. I think as much as people like to lift up that time, like Dr. King was actually losing at that time. Like Malcolm points this out in Message to the Grassroots.
When Martin Luther King failed to desegregate Albany, Georgia, the civil rights struggle in America reached its low point. King became bankrupt almost as a leader. Plus, even financially, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was in financial trouble, plus it was in trouble, period.
And then the March on Washington kind of reinvents them in that same year, even though the 4 little girls happens like the very next month on September 16th. So he's speaking from a place and criticizing people, but his strategy is actually not working at that time either. And I think sometimes people fail to put that in context. And then this book also talks about the Negro Revolution. And King talks about how Birmingham and such was this pop off of the Negro Revolution. Again, Malcolm goes on in the Message to Grassroots to criticize the Negro Revolution. And he says, there is no revolution where you lock arms.
The only revolution based on loving your enemy is the Negro Revolution. The only revolution in which the goal is a desegregated lunch counter, a desegregated theater, a desegregated park, and a desegregated public toilets. You can sit down next to white folks on the toilet. That's no revolution.
And he distinguishes it with the Black Revolution. He says the Black Revolution is worldwide.
The white man knows what a revolution is. He knows that the Black Revolution is worldwide, in scope and in nature. The Black Revolution is sweeping Asia, sweeping Africa. It's rearing its head in Latin America. The Cuban Revolution, that's a revolution. They overturned the system.
And he starts to make these international connections. And that's why he points to the Algerian Revolution, all these revolutions throughout the world. So I'm just saying all that so people have some context that, you know, these things were in conversation with each other. Like, as Dr. King is saying that, you know, there was some pushback. And one of Malcolm's most famous speeches, again, message to the grassroots. But when he tries to say that again, I don't want to be super critical because I wasn't there. You know, originally, like I said, a lot of this was written in jail. So I'm not gonna shit on the man or anything. But I think he oversimplifies the so-called extremists. It kind of becomes a straw man argument that the extremists are just these people who want to just go into the streets and kill all the white folks. And if you listen to any of the so-called extremists at the time, that wasn't their position. There was some caution, there was strategy, just like there was with direct action, just like there was with nonviolence. So I just think that needs to be clarified.
I mean, I think even you know, with the example that you gave earlier to Black of some of the revolutions that are taking place in contemporary times through elections, even that's strategic, right? I don't think that there is not this moralistic, ethical decision to say we're not going to go to war. The truth is that violence actually continues to be the dominating force. And the reason why people have made strategic decisions to overturn governments in different kinds of ways is because of the scale of violent intervention that the US is able to met upon these species, if that is the way that they decide to go, right? And so the move away from guerrilla warfare is not a moral ethical one. It's a real strategical, tactical one. Like, these motherfuckers will bomb us. Like, and that's not the way that we can really do that. In this moment.
Cuba may never have even became dominantly a Marxist, Leninist, or communist country had the U.S. not continued to bomb their airports. You know, they pushed them there in many ways. Like, it didn't just.
Well, not only that, the first place Fidel Castro came was to the U.S. So it's the same story with Nkrumah.
It is.
Patrice Lumumba, they all come to the U.S. first. The U.S. is like, fuck y'all. If you're not free market capitalist, we're not fucking with you. If you're non-aligned, socialist adjacent, communist, any of that shit, because initially the Cuban Revolution was not necessarily socialist.
No,
right?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
And so the other thing
same with Venezuela.
The other thing that King kind of gets wrong is that, let me not say that King gets wrong. Let me not speak against people leader, but like, okay. So because what he's saying is what makes them extremists is that they're not taking up a position that's able to galvanize the masses. But again, what he seemed to recognize later on about the Cuban Revolution is that was a tiny minority. That through that direct violence, the overthrow of the Batista regime, that is what galvanized the masses. And so here he's setting up a dichotomy, it seems to me, between armed struggle or advocacy of armed struggle and alienation. Now, that might be because he understands white folks. And he's probably right, because armed Black people since Nat Turner and before, that's never going to get like the white folks on your side. But it's also like, what exactly do you need all the white folks on your side for change? Like, what is your sort of, and
what does get all the white people on your side?
Exactly. And because they certainly want on his goofy ass side.
Nothing except laying down and giving them every fucking thing you got. Nothing but that.
Thing. His is not a dialectical theory of change or dialectical understanding of struggle at this moment. But again, by 1967, he's talking about the Cuban Revolution in an affirmative way. He still believes that it is not the method to take in the US. But he's also saying, like, that is an example of a very small minority being able to implement change throughout a particular society. And so this idea that is very much this idea that Black people's armed struggle, on the one hand, I think that it's right to call it extremist, and when you're lining it up in relationship to US settler colonialism, right? On the other hand, the fact that always becomes a sort of specter of undermining the ultimate goal, whatever that is, or that becomes the sort of the non-starter, I think is problematic as fuck.
Mhm.
Even in 1963, you know what I mean? Because if we look at the ways, if we look at how Black people have been able, how we have been able to defend ourselves and how we have been able to sort of implement change, it has been the whole panoply
Of all those things.
of
And
tools,
that's what I
including
think is
violence.
actually important, even about those who were criticized as supposedly publicly anti-King stands. Most of them, Malcolm never refuted the potential use of nonviolence as a strategy, and even later on, none of King's other they didn't say that it had no use. They made a decision that they were not going to be principally nonviolent.
It
That
wasn't
was
a
not
philosophy. It wasn't a philosophy.
exactly.
Yeah.
That
yeah.
wasn't how they were going to engage in a basic sense. That, like you said, and I think your point, Sharice, about it not being a sort of dialectical theory of change is that, right? And I think that followers, I think that his followers, when I say followers, I mean it loosely. I mean people who saw the work and the value in what King did, but then differed in some of the approaches. They saw precisely that, and they said, okay, you can do that in this regard. I mean, that was famously Kwame's critique.
Kwame Ture.
Yeah, well, Kwame Ture.
Kwame Ture.
Kwame Ture's critique of King. He said, you can rock with King or you can rock with us. You could go the nonviolent route, or you can come over here and deal with this other shit. And just know that if you don't do that is the path of least resistance. And we suggest you go that way. But and I'm not saying he wasn't talking to Black people, he was talking to enemies of Black people. Right. And so I think that is, I mean, obviously this is a conversation that's been had many times, but I think that that's always what's important, even about this conversation about nonviolence. That the issue with nonviolence is not an issue about whether you choose in a particular instance to engage nonviolence as a strategy or a tactic. It is about making this steadfast decision that no matter what the occurrence is, that is how we will engage, and that decision is based on the conscience of white people. Always.
Yeah. But the other thing too, I think is problematic is his veneration of Gandhi. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Fuck Gandhi, period. Gandhi was casteist. Gandhi was racist. Gandhi might have maybe come along later on to some aspect of anti-racism, but that was not the foundation of him taking on, his hunger strikes and his nonviolent shit. So fuck Gandhi, period.
Yeah, I think even what he says there, again, coming back to that Malcolm speech, like he's defending direct action, but the March on Washington was supposed to be direct action. It got changed into something else. Like that was initially people were going to lay down in front of the airports, and the goal was to shut down Washington. And then Stephen Currier and the Carlisle group and the Kennedy administration reached out to the big six organizations and corralled to have this March on Washington, which was pretty non-threatening. They suppressed speeches
for jobs and freedom.
Yeah, that part, the jobs part definitely never happened. But it's like they suppressed the things that was originally supposed to be. Again, in that same speech, Malcolm. So even like you were saying, Malcolm wasn't always like saying shoot up the club. That wasn't the narrative. So he even makes a distinction in that speech that that was the Black Revolution. They were going to shut down Washington till they got a civil rights bill, right? He says that in the speech, but instead it became this, as he called it, a farce on Washington. Where that got watered down. Now, again, I get if we're gonna be dialectical that you make strategic decisions, and I'm sure King and the rest of the leaders at the time may have felt like this was the best thing to do because they were able to get money because they made a whole civil rights fund off of that march for jobs and freedom or whatever, and they were able to leverage things, and they did get 2 bills within the following years, whether it was the desegregation bill or the voting rights bill.
Voting rights and civil rights.
Yeah, 64 and 65. So it's like they were able to get those things. So you can debate whether that was the best choice to make. But I'm saying even in this sense, or even in that particular instance, Dr. King didn't even hold to his own kind of like direct action kind of principle. Someone else went out and did direct action And then they outflanked him. Because like I said, at the time, the civil rights movement in 63, that was not a good year for them overall. Again, it was not a good year. Like, they weren't moving fast enough. And that's why he made that criticism. And then the people went out and decided, okay, we're kind of done with them. And they were going to do a march on Washington. And then they were able to kind of reignite themselves into it. So I'm saying King didn't even necessarily hold up to his own principles in that moment.
But I think what's also important to understand is A. Philip Randolph. I know that's people man's, but if you understand the initial March on Washington movement between 1941 and 1943, that was the model for the 1963 March on Washington. And that it was the same type of shit. It's desegregate the military. So, that's where 8803 came from. Desegregate the military or we will march. It's always seen as a tactical threat for some type of official policy, right? And so I think that anyway, the role of A. Philip Randolph and the way that 1941 to 1943 march served as a sort of model, because A. Philip Randolph, I think, was integral to organizing this 1963.
Yeah,
him and Bayard Rustin.
They're part of the Big Six. His union was part of the Big Six. So yeah.
So again, that's y'all man's, but I think it's really important to. So, and this reminds me of something that I think you said too, Black, earlier about not just, yes, the white liberals and the right moderates, but the Black liberals and the Black moderates too, because they often moderate themselves, right? And they're serving their historical managerial function. And I just really want us to interrogate A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and because in the final analysis, it's a union meant to build up a middle class. And what that looks like and what that means, that anything that has an object of class formation, or middle class formation in particular, is going to look a certain type of way. And anyway, so I just, really read up on A. Philip Randolph, because people love him, and it's a no for me. Okay. Him and Bayard Rustin, no. And it's not anything related to homophobia. It has everything to do with him. Okay.
I don't want to be guilty of. I just want to ask a question. Sorry, I don't want to be guilty of creating a straw man of the other side, whether I agree with them or not. So, I just want to ask y'all: is there any efficacy? Is there any upside to the strategy that was employed, whether it was March on Washington or whether it's just a general strategy that Dr. King was employing and some of his comrades? Is there any upside to that strategy and describe that strategy as far as yes, we are going to appeal to the conscience of white folks on some level. We are going to get our rights so we can assert ourselves in this world, and we're going to do the best we can to evade some of the more extremist violence or extremist forms of the state by trying to work with them. Is there any efficacy to that in the context of 1963? I'm not even necessarily saying it makes sense today. Is there anything to that?
I think there absolutely was efficacy to that, especially when you, and I'm not saying this in a dismissive way, but when you relegate the confines of your struggle to your experience as Black people in the United States, it makes sense that your struggle would be one for rights from the state. And in order to think about the nature of that struggle differently, you have to be thinking about, one, these are not rights that the state can grant you, because you are already questioning the legitimacy of the state. But in that instance, King wasn't necessarily questioning the legitimacy of the state. And so when it came to the attempt to get laws passed and or repealed that made it so that Black people could have access to certain things. I mean, even in the She Gathered Me segment, a part of what Coretta's fight after King died was about welfare reform, right? And there's all kinds of issues with what it means to ask for what the welfare state does in the context of the United States, right? Because you can very well make the argument that the welfare state creates is a stopgap measure that doesn't actually that creates the conditions that allow people to continue to live at a bare minimum, right? and that there is a level of cruelty in fighting against a welfare state so that people can be so miserable that they will actually want to engage in revolution. But there is something to that, I think, intellectually, theoretically, because being able to sustain at a base level will make people, I mean, that's what they did with us in slavery. You know, you give people just a little bit, make sure they have a little bit of contact with their family, make sure they can have a little bit of joy so that people can say, well, at least we have this. And that's the shit Black people been saying forever in this goddamn country. At least, motherfuckers still say shit like, at least we're not still slaves in Africa. At least we're not still in Africa. At least they brought us Christianity. At least, so like, so there's, to your question, there's absolutely efficacy in that if that's the nature of your struggle. But when you understand the nature of the struggle to be more than that,
I think that across the board, that moderate approach is the approach, period. I think that is right. I think that it's right based on primarily on the context that Layla laid out, because let's be clear, 3% or less of a given population is radical. I think he's absolutely right. Most people ain't taking up no arms, period. They're not doing it, right? And so if you're struggling in not even just a US, but oftentimes in a nation-based context, if there's not the right correlation of forces, right? If there is, if you're in a white supremacist settler colony, it absolutely makes sense. And it's not only pragmatic, but it's probably the sort of, it might even be the ethical thing to advocate vis-a-vis, like, let us say, revolutionary suicide, as Huey P. Newton called it. Because if you know that the state has a monopoly on violence, is it ethical to call people to arms to challenge that, knowing that you really cannot win? Now, the question is, can you really not win? That's the question. And what does it mean to win? And what do you actually win or gain struggling within the context of the system, right? In hindsight, we can see it was some people, like, you know, that class art, the sort of class differentiation among Black people became more entrenched starting in that movement and moving forward. So there was more middle class and even more sort of elites. There was a sort of Black political class that came out of that methodology of struggle. But what does it mean to win, right? But I think that by and large, I absolutely understand why it is that King and those before him and those after him advocated what they did. And then the other thing to point out that's important that King talks about when he says that nonviolent direct action is born out of militancy, he's right, because nonviolent direct action vis-a-vis the purely NAACP legal strategy, it is comparatively militant, right? Just as armed struggle vis-a-vis nonviolent direct action is comparatively militant, right? But then nonviolent or armed struggle vis-a-vis the legal strategy is extremist, right? So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Let me just say this. Ain't no white person hit me in the head with no motherfucking brick and with me not retaliating. Period. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that is a philosophical question of, I mean, I'll just keep evoking Malcolm, but it's like, you know, as he said, the price of freedom is death. You know, and a lot of people don't necessarily want to pay that price. But I think you have to ask yourself, like, what are you actually struggling for? And I think if we are saying it's dialectical, and if we are saying there's contradictions, then if you are going to take the more pragmatic approach, then you don't get to say on the other side of that it's all good and that those contradictions don't exist. And I think that's my issue often with the people who uphold this argument. I'm like, yeah, you are probably right that you are less likely to die, I guess, if you take this approach versus if we showed up with guns or whatever, even though I still think that that's a very cartoonish.
They all died at the hands of guns, though.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Like,
That's why I say I guess. That's why I'm like, But I'm saying like, but that's still, I think even the whole idea of people taking up guns, I think often is a very like that. I think that's a straw man. It's a very cartoonish expression of what any of the people on that side were even advocating. Nobody was just saying like, because that's not even if everybody agreed to violent revolution, just grabbing guns and shooting the next white person wouldn't be smart anyway. Like I'm saying, that's not actually a good strategic plan. But I'm saying like, I think that even if we were to concede that argument that, you are less likely to physically die, like what does die? What are you losing in that process? What is being conceded by taking the path of the least resistance in comparison to a more extremist goal? I think that's a question that doesn't necessarily get asked. It's just assumed that this path will lead to best benefits when anything is a cost benefit analysis in any situation. And it's just assumed that this is
how capitalist of you. That was real capitalist, Piggy. A cost benefit analysis.
But I'm saying like anything you have to weigh the pros and the cons. But like, so I'm saying like if you're doing something, you have to be honest with that. And that's what I'm saying. That's why I felt like Malcolm, when he said the price of freedom is death, I fuck with that because he's being honest. Like he's not saying like this is all gonna be rosy. He's like, no, it could really, but he's like, if you're not willing to take that line, then that's what he says in the speech. Then don't use that word. Don't say revolution. Just leave it alone. You ain't about that life. Like, just don't go there, right? But like, so you want something else, but don't call that revolution. If you want to be integrated into this, that's not revolution. That's something else. I'm not saying it doesn't have a ethical stance. I'm not saying it's not pragmatic, but I don't think that's not revolution. That's not that. And I think we just need to stop confusing those things. Like, just be honest. Like, you don't want to go there, and you might have a point because you think you're going to lose. Fair enough. Nobody's saying that you're a punk for that, but don't confuse it for what it is.
Yeah, but Malcolm also, but he wasn't even just talking about revolution. I think it's in 1964 or maybe 1965, he gave this speech before the second meeting of the Organization of African American Unity. And he said the price of freedom, that is to say human rights, is as a willingness to die, right? That it's not just revolution in some, as you said, cartoonish or abstract sense. Human rights. It's like literally human rights. You know what I mean? Which is different than the sort of liberal rights and recognition from the state, but human rights, right? To be recognized as fully human, like that, the price of that's the price, like, willingness to die is the price of the ticket. But I think that perhaps to MLK's point, or any point, which side is better organized? If it is that the nonviolence, if it is that nonviolence was able to galvanize the masses and was more organized comparatively than like folks advocating armed struggle as a tool, then absolutely then go with nonviolence. And I think that in 1963, I don't know if that the quote unquote extremists were organized in a way that would have made them more effective. They, I think that over time, I don't know how organized. Well, actually, the nonviolent direct action, that faction was very organized because they have been at it at least since 1954 with the Montgomery bus boycott, primarily led and organized by Black women. And so there was a infrastructure, I think, that was there. And so, and this is just a broader sense, whichever side or whichever faction is more organized, that's whose strategy or that's whose tactic you go with at that moment. Of course, that's not transhistorical. That's not something that's not, their approach shouldn't be the sort of the Bible or the law or whatever. But I think that organization is really, really, really important. You have to be organized and you have to have some type of discipline. And I think that at that moment, part of what MLK is gesturing toward is that nonviolent direct action in that moment had a more disciplined, organized approach. And I think he's right about it. I mean,
and
that's a material analysis. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, he was. And I mean, this isn't anything profound or anything, but I just feel like, that point that you just made, sure, like that is something that we have to acknowledge, that even in terms of the price of freedom is death, King, even through his nonviolent stance, was willing to die, right? Like, I mean, and that was still something that people had to face. And so, like the joke that you made earlier, Sharice, like if somebody hits you in your face, you're gonna hit them back. There is like none of Martin's close, people who were close to him, but on the other side, none of them would diminish the fact that it takes a particular amount of discipline, bravery, strength to face that, to make a decision to let people hit you, spit on you, kick you, whatever, and face it, and decide not to respond in what would be a very human way to respond, which is to respond to violence with violence. That would be a very natural way to respond. And so, like, I just think that has to be said just for the purpose of the conversation, that to say that we needn't make it a principle, that we die on, doesn't take away from, the importance of it as a tactic and what it means to be able to actually take that up and stick to it. Mm-hmm. And it does take a type of revolutionary discipline to be able to enact nonviolence in that way, even if we disagree that is what will help us achieve whatever our ultimate goals are in terms of actual freedom revolution.
And I think Kwame Ture said, I was just looking through Stokely Speaks. He said, talking about Martin Luther King, because I don't want people to think I'm bashing him, but I'm just trying to like lay out some different points. I'm saying, like, he said, Martin Luther King taught us many things. We must understand what he taught us and accept it. He taught us how to confront. Dr. King did, not the Black Panther Party, not Malcolm X. Dr. Martin Luther King, his tactic was nonviolence, but he did teach us how to confront, and confront he did. We thank him for that. And he taught us how to mobilize the masses. And then he goes on to talk about how Dr. King wasn't a politician, he was a minister and so on and so forth. But like Dr. King did confront power. I guess what I'm pushing on, not necessarily Dr. King, because a lot of people don't even want to ride out with that either. But in this speech, Kwame also talks about how when Malcolm was saying what he did, it's like, we didn't want nothing to do with him at the time. Like, Black people were scared. I think the last poet said, and niggas are scared of revolution. Niggas love to hear Malcolm rap, but niggas didn't love Malcolm. Like, a lot of people didn't want to go there. Like, they like to hear that speech. So in that sense, Dr. King was right in one of those earlier excerpts that people get aroused by that stuff. But when it's like, all right, here we go, it's like, ain't nobody coming. But the irony is that happened to him too, even with nonviolence. People, like, when he pushed that too far, same kind of abandonment, right? So it's like, once you push too far, regardless of your tactic, like we said, if you're organized, your organization is eventually going to run into a conflict, that's going to put people in a position where they have to make some serious positions about, is this something they want to proceed with or not? Because now it's not just some fun and rosy story no more. Now you are facing a gun. Now you are facing prison. Now you are facing, political imprisonment or something. Like, now you are up against that if you're going to press against the power structure. So I think sometimes when we get caught up on the nonviolence versus violence kind of dichotomy, that obscures the fact that if you are disrupting what the state is attempting to do, whether that's by shutting down things, by getting your ass beat and you just shut down production, or you're going to roll up with guns, whether we agree with one or the other, like, you're going to have to deal with some major pushback. The repression is going to come. So the guns and the violence thing, I think, sometimes distort what you're up against, because we're talking about tactics often, even if we might favor one over another.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I have two things to say. One is about televisual media, and one is about, it's one thing for nonviolence to be a tactic. It's another for it to be your methodology and your philosophy of struggle. And I think that is part of what Kwame Ture was pointing out, right? It's one thing for it to be so by any means necessary is a philosophy of struggle. Nonviolent direct action can be a tactic, or it can be your whole methodology of struggle. And I think that that's the point, right? And not only that becomes your philosophy, that then becomes a bludgeon against folks who struggle otherwise. I think that becomes a problem. It's the same thing. Like, people very much misunderstand the Booker T. Washington versus Du Bois. Du Bois's biggest critique of Booker T. Washington was the way that he shut down space to struggle in the ways that we ought to articulate what it is that Black people deserve, because Booker T. Washington was, he was stopping bags and he didn't need no red octagon, to paraphrase Nikki, right? So he was making it so people could not publish. He was making it so people couldn't get jobs, so that they would be harassed and marginalized in a particular way. And that's what Du Bois was against. He's like, industrial education is important, but this authoritarian way that you're shrinking our cartography and our methodologies of struggle is extremely problematic. The other thing that I wanted to say, I think that the genius of nonviolent direct action at that exact moment was through the rise of televisual media, because this is when television was becoming more or less normalized, and it just showed the viciousness and the savagery and the barbarity of these white folks. And the other thing that it also showed the savagery of the system when the state did not come to help people, right? And so I think that that was its efficacy, was that these are the people who fought against fascism. These are the people who are saying that they're the arbiters and leaders of freedom and democracy. They're beating up children. They're unleashing water hoses and dogs and vitriol in manifold ways against these people that are sitting there, right? These people are, their arms are linked up, they're not doing shit, and you're beating them, you're pouring shit on their head, doing all sorts of barbaric things. And so I think that that approach was able to heighten the contradictions on the one hand, and then like reveal them in a sort of a national and a global way, in ways that I think by 1966, when the Panthers are rolling up with guns, that doesn't have the same, and that is not to reduce the Panthers to that, but that is not the same. It doesn't have the same galvanizing effect, right? What the Panthers did was important because they were showing that we too have the right to bear arms. So fuck y'all. Now, granted, like by the next year, that the rights had been truncated again, especially for Black people. But anyway, so all of that to say, I think the context in which nonviolent direct action was coming about was also extremely and extraordinarily effective.
I think it was more effective in the South than it was going to be where the Panthers were as well. Like, I think that we saw that when Dr. King tried to take some of that up north, even when he went to Chicago, it didn't work as well, even though he actually described Chicago as the most hateful place he had been at the time, even compared to places in the South. But I think when dealing with Jim Crow and the ways that those laws played out, and I'm not making an argument that one is better than the other. I'm just saying, as far as tactically speaking, like, I think that kind of approach helps more in the South. But when you're dealing with some of the issues that people had up north, which materially speaking aren't the exact same things, like nonviolent actions not going to be as effective in California and Oakland as it was going to be in Birmingham or one of those small counties in Mississippi that SNCC used to go to. And then when you read the people at the time, like, they say this, like, this isn't some, retrospective like analysis. Like, they say this, even King says some of this, Kwame says some of this. Like, they note that the strategies changed and they kind of were confused and struggling with how are we going to deal with this beyond some of the Jim Crow laws, like what's the next move. So that also is what I think brings people to quote unquote violence or self-defense, at least, is just realizing like there are limitations to this depending on what we're fighting against. And fighting against Jim Crow and Bull Connor and people who don't have enough discipline to just let them march, and they had to beat everybody up, like they found in other places that there was a bit more sophistication when you're dealing with someone like Mayor Daley in Chicago than when you're dealing with Bull O'Connor. Like, it changes based on the context. I think that's important too.
Yeah, because there's already nominal desegregation in these places. And so going to sit, as you're saying, like the material, the structural conditions manifest differently. So I think that that's right. But I do think that it's still jarring for me when I see these children getting their ass whooped. It is jarring. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, all these people are trying to do is literally just go here to exist, and this was happening. I do think that was a way to incite or to open up a particular type of consciousness, especially for those who really believe the lie of the US, right? That that white people are the arbiters of civilization. So I guess the last thing, we've been talking for quite a long time, but so I guess the last thing that I'm just kind of thinking about is, one is like, is nonviolence the old guard now, right? The old guard that King was talking about vis-a-vis like legalism. Is nonviolence now the old guard, right? The conservative approach. And then like, do we need new strategies and tactics, or do we just need to implement them in new ways? Or like, yeah, I'm just interested in what y'all think about that.
I mean, to the last question, do we need new strategy and tactics? I mean, my question is, are we free? If we ain't free. And when I say we need new, that doesn't mean we throw away everything, but we do. Like, we do need to continue to think about what has worked, what hasn't worked, what has worked to certain degrees and why hasn't it, and what things can be retooled, not necessarily thrown away. Like, so new doesn't necessarily, to me, always mean reinventing the wheel, but we do have to continue to think with the time. And I don't even, in terms of the nonviolent versus sort of legalism question, I don't even know if there is if that question about nonviolence as a methodology, as a practice in that way is even as prescient, because, as a part of the conversation that we were having before, I think so much of the struggle, both inside the US as a demographic minority, and even outside of the US in countries where the sort of military apparatus is not as developed, not as funded, I just don't know that there is a reasonable, I don't know that armed warfare is the same type of option that it was pre, drones and GPS, global positioning systems that are able to tell you where people are without even having to come out of the comfort of your home. So I mean, it's a completely different playing field. And so to that, I mean, that means obviously we need new strategies and tactics, because we're in a different world.
Yeah, to the first question, I would say no. I don't know if it's the new guard or the old guard, because I don't necessarily see a hunger to try something much different than that, generally speaking, even amongst people who are, activists or of that nature. And that's not necessarily a criticism. I'm just saying, like, it seems to be that the general tactic is still to go out and protest, in a nonviolent manner. I mean, that's what, when we just look, that's what people are doing. Like, by and large, now folks might be more sympathetic to the folks who do quote unquote loot or riot. Like, you don't see as much shaming from Black Lives Matter activists about people who do that, but by and large, that's not what they're doing. That's not
that would make it the old guard then, right? Because it's become the normalized way. That's what, if we remember, old guard was what is the tradition? What is the thing that the conservative forces are trying to preserve, right? What is the normalized way of struggle? So it seems like that would be then nonviolence, based on how you described it, which I agree with, would be the old guard. It's the means of doing things.
Well, yeah,
it's not to say that there's a new guard, but
okay, yeah. I mean, in that sense, if you're saying that that tradition is carried on, then yeah, I would agree. I guess I was thinking of it more like, is there an alternative that you could, I guess, juxtapose against it? And I'm saying I don't really see that. So I guess that's why I was saying no. But in that sense, yeah, like, it's pretty much continued. It just expresses itself differently. Like, Black Lives Matter has rejected largely like the kind of respectability politics of the previous generation, whether, that's another episode to talk about respectability politics. But I'm saying, like, they've rejected that kind of narrative. And in some ways, I think in positive ways, especially when it comes to, like, queer representation and things of that nature. But as far as a general tactic, nah. Do we need new tactics? Yeah. I mean, I think I agree with Layla on that one. Like, I mean, you always have to deal with the situation that you're in. So yeah, if you're in a situation in which we're talking about with television, right? And at the time, television is like almost this new form of media. And you're also dealing in a situation, I would say to the people, like, there was like 4 channels. Like, things were just more centralized. So if an event happened, everybody watched it on the news. You know, like, something can happen now and you don't even know about it because it's in some niche market somewhere else. Like, even if it's got millions of followers, you don't even know about it. Like, media operated differently. So when it comes to mobilization and doing an event and trying to bring attention to something, that attention would sustain itself longer because there just weren't as many events that even were being covered, they weren't happening. You do something now, there's so much happening around the world. Mobilization is just way more ineffective than it was when in Dr. King's day, because there were just so many different things. Like today, there's just so many different things that you have to play up against. So when you try to quote unquote raise awareness, or we try to do like a hashtag campaign or something like that, it just fades into the abyss because news is 24/7. Like, news wasn't 24/7 back then. People just went to sleep. You know, there wasn't a news cycle constantly going on. Information wasn't just being flooded. There weren't nearly as many distractions. Obviously, there wasn't social media. So the way we even like relate to each other and consume information and consume the way we understand the world is much different. So I think if something like we see when something like Palestine happens, like when it finally blows up on the news and it gets attention, it just fades back into the abyss, you know, because there's just something else, you know, in a different time. Maybe I'm not saying, you know, that it would get resolved, but I'm saying in a different time, I think that story would be harder to fade away into something else. But now it's just easier because there's another story. And then people don't even engage something like that properly, like Palestine, and then it's SOS Cuba, like and the disinformation campaigns, the propaganda, like, yeah, things are so much different. So I think you definitely need new tactics to address yourself to that and to try to formulate theories that people had dealing with their material conditions into today. I think is always a mistake.
Yeah, it was interesting. Part of what I was thinking about when both you guys were talking, but especially what you were just saying, Too Black, is like, now, okay, whereas like with the rise of televisual media, the spectacular nature of violence was part of what made non-violent direct action a visceral or like a strong tactic. Now, number one, violence is completely normalized because it's in all of our shows. It's day to day, whereby now not looking, not watching, and rejecting the spectacle is not revolutionary at all, the radical option, right? Which I think I'm telling you, I have never seen one of them videos of these people being murdered by the police. I've seen zero. I do not watch them, right? Which is interesting. Which is a sort of, I think, a reflection of where we are now, where violence is so normalized that it's not as if I need to see this to be like, oh my gosh, right? I don't know. So just talking about how times have changed.
Even then, we didn't need to see it. But even then, we didn't need to see right. It wasn't for us to see. It was for white people to see. So that part of it is the same, because we were still seeing that level of violence every day, even when it wasn't on TV. Because we were seeing those daily interactions with the police. We were seeing. We are seeing those things, and so that. But
I also wonder if that's regional. Like the point that Too Black made, I also wonder if that was regional. If people who lived outside of the South, or who lived in maybe in other areas, they might have been too. Right. But I think, but I think
were getting fucked up.
But I think but then that raises the question, right? I think it's the intensity and the sort of the all-encompassing nature of it, because if that's the case, then why is it that the tactics that were being used to combat that type of violence in the South were not effective? I think it's the same type of thing where the level of confrontation.
I think that was other issues. I think a part of what they talked about, a part of what didn't translate in those tactics was, one, how deeply rooted the organizational structures were in church hierarchies, and the church hierarchy did not translate to the social conditions of the cities in the same types of way that they did in the South. the age-related hierarchies did not translate the same way from the South as they did to the cities. So it wasn't just, I mean, that was part of it. It was the nonviolent chat, but it wasn't just that. It was that so many of the social norms that came with that campaign were foreign to life in the cities. But the epidemic of violence wasn't. And
but
so like even your
think about Emmett Till. The way that Emmett Till hit Emmett Till, the fact that Emmett Till went from Chicago down south and was murdered in the way that he was murdered galvanized people outside of the South, precisely because there was not that same, there was an idea, I think that there was an idea that outside, like police violence notwithstanding, there's this idea that outside the South, that type of violence did not happen, or it was not routinized in the way. Like, I don't think we can conflate.
I don't think that's what it was, because also the thing is, at that time, people were not that removed from even not daily, but regular experiences in the South. Like, my dad grew up in Chicago, and he at that age, my uncle was the age of Emmett Till when he was killed in Chicago. Same sort of migratory routes. When my dad told me when he was going to Chicago, they were the only people in their block that didn't go back south for the summer because they didn't still have those connections, that family. So I don't think that it was that foreign. I think that there are elements of it that were, but I don't think it was that foreign. And I just think that the way that the violence looked daily, I think that the way that non-state entities, like people who were not police, people who were not direct agents of the state, that might have looked a little bit different. But I don't think
that's
it was
precisely
that
the point. That's precisely the point.
Different.
When people are like marching and sitting in and getting shit dumped on their heads, it's police, but it's regular ass motherfuckers. It's regular, ordinary people. It's mothers. Like, fuck that. My kids ain't going to school with these niggas. Like, it's all of those things, right? And so I think that,
but that was still happening.
The confrontation with violence, the routinized, I think the white supremacist violence is ubiquitous throughout the United States. But I think that the way that televisual media highlighted a particular form and a particular vitriol of violence is something that I think was shocking to Black people who did not live in those day-to-day conditions.
I don't think so. I don't necessarily know that, but I don't think it was that shocking to Black people. I really don't, because I think even now with the because part of what has happened now with the second sort of, or maybe third iteration of the sort of televisual, is that the way that police have been planting evidence on Black people, and the way that they distort shit or whatever. Black people who live sort of middle class suburban lives, on the one hand, might have been removed to a degree from that, but there's still not the same level of convincing that has to happen for a number of Black people. I don't think it's that foreign.
It's not.
I don't actually think that was the nature of the contradiction.
It's not about being convinced. I think it's being confronted with that still has a particular type of jarring effect. It's kind of like, for example, again, I'm free. I'm not incarcerated, and I see all the police, all the shit that happens out here. I am appalled when confronted with the intensity and entrenchment of barbarity that happen when we get those glimpses of people who are incarcerated. Even as a Black person, even as a person who sees the way that policing operates outside of those walls. It's not because I'm ignorant, but it's because it's a different exposure and a different depth. And so I think that even if you're one generation removed. So for example, I have 2 siblings that are incarcerated, right? So I'm very close to it, but not being in those conditions, I think still makes exposure to a particular type of violence, or the way that violence accrues around that population, spectacular, right? It's jarring to me. I mean, and maybe it's just me, but I think that I just don't think that Black people, because they were Black and had family in the South, would not have been confronted in a particular way.
It's not because they were Black and had it. It's that they were having their own types of experience. Like, even for me as a person who has not, I've not been incarcerated, but having grown up visiting members incarcerated in all different types of prisons, I don't know. I don't have this. I mean, it's weird because I don't want to say that I don't have. I see it and I see this awfulness, but I don't. Unfortunately, for me, it's not jarring in that way, and I don't know why. And so I don't. I don't know. That's why I think it's not. I don't know. Having had to be strip searched to visit family members in supermax prisons, and I don't know. Like we're not at all experiencing it on the same level that people who are actually incarcerated are. But even to experience it at that reduced level gave me a glimpse, even as a child, of what they must be experiencing inside. And so then when I did actually see what those things were, it wasn't that jarring because me, who's 13 years old and ain't did shit, getting strip searched to be able to go just visit you, tells me that not only do they see you as a threat, but they see me as a threat because I'm still willing to acknowledge your humanity.
And yet there's a way that, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, Black people are different. So it's a different thing. But I just know that when I see like shit covered floors and people sleeping in that galvanizes me in a particular way, even if I have not been an incarcerated person. And it's still the contrast. I guess it is the very contrast, even as violence is happening outside, that I think makes me want to mobilize in a particular way. But Two Black, weigh in on this. What do you think?
I was letting y'all have it. I was just enjoying it. I didn't have any popcorn, but but no, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I had an incarcerated brother. I mean, he's no longer incarcerated, so I don't know. I mean, I try to keep most personal information offline, but I remember one time he had a bounty on his head or some shit, and he called me and I had to like send money in or whatever. So like I've had to deal with that, directly. So I guess for me, since I wasn't that detached from it, like it wasn't like necessarily, it was jarring in a sense like, oh shit, I got to send him some money because like I don't want nothing to happen to him. But it was in a sense of like that reality is not that far removed. But I don't know. I mean, if they say 1 in 4 Black men at some point in their life will be incarcerated, then that means majority of us have some relationship to somebody incarcerated, just based on simple math. So it's like most of us have some attachment to that, even if we don't engage it that well. So it's not necessarily, I don't know if I use the word appalling, but I guess CBS, I don't think you're saying that it was like a surprise or anything. I don't think that's what you're saying, that it was like, oh my God, they lynched Black people. I don't think just, for people listening, I don't think that's what you're saying, that anybody was surprised. But that if you don't live under that daily, I can see how it still can reignite something that maybe you kind of like let lie a little idle in your mind if you're not dealing with that level. Now, people did get lynched in the North. Like, it's not that didn't happen, right? Or, I mean, I'm from Indiana, so, so I'm saying like people definitely got lynched in the North. But I think I guess when I was listening to y'all talk as well, I think also just the formation of a city versus like in the South, you're not always dealing with like cities. Like you were dealing a lot of times with like small counties where white folks, it would be like 10,000 people and white folks just ran the entire thing, and Black folks they didn't even have their own neighborhood really. They were just kind of scattered throughout the city, and they had no political power whatsoever. And I think when you're in cities, even though you're still under complete oppression, it's just a different formation. So if you're segregated to the south side of the city, you might have a little bit more independence relative to that space than someone who's in one of those small rural counties in the South, where desegregation usually was easier to make happen when you went to those smaller places, even though they say were some of the most violent places. New York or Chicago or in LA, these big metropolitan areas, those tactics are just really off of sheer population density just aren't going to be as effective as they're going to be in a small rural community. Like that's just not going to happen. So I think some of it is just the literal like geography of the situation, not even the cultural makeup. But I agree as well, Layla. Like there's like when Dr. King went to Chicago, like a lot of those ministers, they ain't fuck with him. And then you also have like Black businesses that didn't want desegregation because they were able to benefit from having the monopoly of that market, and a lot of that did exist in the North as well too. So I think there are just a lot of material factors But as far as the violence goes, I think that it also with Emmett Till is like that also galvanized people because like the mother was willing to like put the head on display, you know, and like make sure that people saw that. Like versus in other cases, you might have read about it or something. But we're talking about visuals. Like she put the baby's head on display and like, I want y'all to see what they did to my son. And that I think is for no matter where you live, South, North, that does get a visceral response because you had to look at that. And that was not a time when there was a video every day or there was just something. No, like you didn't see the head. You heard about it. You know, it can't, whether you heard about it by traveling down south or somebody called you, it made its way up north or whatever, but to see the head and everybody has to see that, like that's different than just a story. We all have the stories. We've seen the police do what they do, but even then they carry the body away. But I had to see the aftermath of that. Like that just hits differently. Even when we look at it now, like that hits differently.
Well, and part of what I'm thinking about with like the Emmett Till situation and just thinking about, and it's not even like South versus North in a sort of dogmatic or like complete sense to say that only one type of violence is reducible to the South, only one type of violence is reducible to the North. It's also sort of like the way that white supremacy is ensconced in the customs and the norms in the South in ways that they still are in the North. But for example, like whistling at a white woman, right? That is like rounds of death in a prayer. I don't know. I just think that there's something particular about Emmett Till going from Chicago to the South. I think there's something particular at that case, even in 1955, right? Even though that is not, it's not a Jim Crow is still legal at that point, right? So, or it's like 1 year after Brown versus Board of Education. But anyway, like I think that the overarching point or part of like what me and Layla are thinking through and too, like what we're talking through is just sort of like, what is the effect on Black people? And I never think that it's not a moralism in the way that is for white people, because we know white folks are like, if we believe our own analysis, we know that white folks are violent. That's not the point. The point is I guess one is intensity and two is the sort of the kind of like visceral nature that may or may not, that I think makes something like, for example, when I'm seeing glimpses of like, for example, what's happening at Rikers, it's not that it's unimaginable. It's not that I'm disconnected in any way, because it's not that. It's just living under those conditions is different, and sort of being confronted with it I think there's a significance to that, right? Even if it's not the same effect that it would have on like somebody who thought the US was great or white people are whatever the fuck, you know?
There's a reason that Black people. I was gonna say one thing. I was say there's a reason that Black people migrated from the South, like massively migrated from the South. So like there clearly there was a recognition that what they were dealing with down there was something different. Not to say that, you know, it was nice.
There was also a reason why there's reverse migration too.
Yeah, now, yeah.
Now, right, that happens like in the 80s. It starts in like the 80s, but not.
Yeah. But no, the only thing I was going to say to earlier, Sharice, you had made a point about your not seeing them, and that there's a different stakes to you or Black people making a decision not to consume those videos than white people's decision not to consume those videos. Those stakes are very different, right? And so that's the only thing I wanted, because I was gonna say that earlier, I didn't say that. You're making a decision to not consume that is about a constant attack on your own humanity, your own ability to live and to function in the world. White people often, not always, whatever, but making a decision not to consume those videos is often about maintaining a level of ignorance about a phenomenon that they don't want to be complicit in. And so the stakes of that decision is very different. That's the only one to add earlier.
Yeah, and I agree. And to a certain extent, I feel the same way about how the free population or the unincarcerated population as a whole thinks about prisons. Like a lot of people, Black, white, green, blue, blurple, whatever, choose not to confront that because we want to believe that people who are in jail deserve to be there. And it doesn't fucking matter how you treat them because they're bad. You know what I mean? And I think that is sort of, again, the like level, even as an academic who studies all this shit, even just the level of dehumanization is like, God damn, like, really? You know what I mean? Like we have, or it's more other outside of that, it's like we have to do something about this, period. You know what I mean? And so I'm gonna rant about the new Jim Crow in a minute and how calling everything, you know, but I think that to that point, everything that we've been discussing here, especially the sort of exchange that we had, points to why these type of analogies like Jim Crow just obfuscate everything. They don't get to the sort of dynamics and complexity of what people from King to Malcolm X to Kwame Ture, et cetera, are struggling against, right? Because it makes Jim Crow this totalizing thing that accounts for everything. And as we've been discussing, that's just like absolutely not the case. All right, so just to bring this back like around full circle, this like history of the present, I think we like we cover a lot of ground, but I think that part of what I've gotten out of this conversation is just that, you know, as I say often, like history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, that those same types of old versus new, legitimate versus illegitimate, like what these dichotomies or these sort of contradictions or tensions that I think King was grappling with in like Why We Can't Wait continue today. And that's precisely why we do history of the present, is to think about how the past like informs what we're doing now. So, and the other thing I think that it points out is that King was a person. He was complicated, full of contradictions. He has some bars, some bullshit, like the rest of us, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm sure I will come off harsh in this segment.
I think
what
so.
I'm saying, like, but yeah, I think it's just important to engage people. Like, I don't think that's what we were saying at the beginning, as far as just like deification. You don't get any of this kind of discussion when you do that, because you're just constantly trying to uphold some image of them. But you got to engage them. Like, we're actually reading the man's words. Like, we're comparing his words of what other people said in the time. Like, you have to be, I think that if our goal is to really struggle towards any kind of like liberation, like I think that's what you got to do. And it's not about trying to protect somebody for some like hollow image that you have in your head. I think you have to be willing to engage. If we put Malcolm's work on the table, we could have the same critical dialogue with that. If we put anyone's work on the table, I think that's what you're supposed to do, because we're trying to learn. Like, if the goal is to just, you know, lift them up and celebrate, I mean, there's a time to do that, right? Like, it's okay to celebrate, but I'm just saying, like, if we're trying to learn, we have to engage people. So I just think that that's an important point to take away from all of this. You have to be willing to engage people's work, engage the struggles that they went in, because they're trying to figure it out just like we are. At the time that they were alive, they were trying to figure it out just like we are. Like you said, they're people, and they didn't have all the answers. None of us do, but we trying to figure it out. And if we ain't trying to figure it out, then I don't know what we're doing anyway.
So cool it with the MLK industrial complex. Damn it.
Okay, so for this week's She Gathered Me, keeping with our theme about Dr. King, I wanted to spotlight Coretta Scott King. We often talk about the strength that it took for Mamie Till to make the decision to show Emmett Till's body, and how, you know, she became a symbol of a movement following her son's death. Coretta Scott King is interesting because I think in a lot of ways, her as a figure, she gains more prominence in the wake of King's death. But it's widely known that she was not only a supporter of King, but she was someone who pushed King politically, intellectually, and particularly where it came to her anti-Vietnam stance. She was actually publicly anti-Vietnam even before King was. And so I wanted to take today's She Gathered Me segment just to read a little bit of a short speech that she gave about 3 weeks after King was killed on April 27, 1968 in Central Park. And so I believe King was slated to speak at this particular moment. She says that she found this note where he had scribbled, she found a piece of paper in his pocket where he had scribbled some notes, and he listed the 10 commandments on Vietnam. I'm not necessarily going to go to the 10 commandments on Vietnam. I want to focus on the latter part of her speech. And so I'm going to read the latter part of her speech. So she says, but just as conscientious action has reversed the tide of public opinion and government policy, we must now turn our attention and the sole force of movement of people of goodwill to the problems of the poor here at home. My husband always saw the problem of racism and poverty here at home and militarism abroad as two sides of the same coin. In fact, it is very clear that our policy at home is to try to solve social problems through military means, just as we have done abroad. The interrelatedness of domestic and foreign affairs is no longer questioned. The bombs we drop on the people of Vietnam continue to explode at home with all of their devastating potential. And so I would invite you to join us in Washington in our efforts to enable the poor people of this nation to enjoy a fair share of America's blessings. There is no reason why a nation as rich as ours should be blighted by poverty, disease, and illiteracy. It is plain that we don't care about our poor people except to exploit them as cheap labor and victimize them through excessive rents and consumer prices. Our Congress passes laws which subsidize corporation farms, oil companies, airlines, and houses for suburbia. But when they turn their attention to the poor, they suddenly become concerned about balancing the budget and cut back the funds for Head Start, Medicare, and mental health appropriations. The most strategic of these cuts is the welfare section of the Social Security Amendment, which freezes federal funds for millions of needy children who are desperately poor, but who do not receive public assistance. It forces mothers to leave their children and accept work or training, leaving their children to grow up in the streets as tomorrow's social problems. This law must be repealed, and I encourage you to join welfare mothers on May 12th, Mother's Day, and call upon Congress to establish a guaranteed annual income instead of these racist and archaic measures. These measures which dehumanize God's children and create more social problems than they solve. We will be marching toward Washington soon. On Thursday, May 2nd, we will return to Memphis to begin where my husband was slain and kick off his Poor People's Campaign. We will be marching towards Washington to demand that America share its abundant life with all of its citizens. We should arrive in Washington by May 17th. I invite you to support the purpose of this march and to join us in Washington on May 30th for the Memorial Day weekend. At this point in the speech, she shifts a bit. She says, I would now like to address myself to the women. The woman power of this nation can be the power which makes us whole and heals the rotten community, now so shattered by war and poverty and racism. I have great faith in the power of women who will dedicate themselves wholeheartedly to the task of remaking our society. I believe that the women of this nation and the women of the world are the best and last hope for peace and brotherhood. This challenge is simply but profoundly stated in the words of one of the greatest Black poets, the late Langston Hughes. He called the poem Mother to Son, but it speaks to the sons and the daughters of this generation and those yet unborn. It speaks of the determination and the indestructible spirit of Black people who refuse to be conquered. The spirit must somehow be imbued in the hearts and souls of women and their sons everywhere. Listen to this Black mother as she counsels her son in all her ungrammatical profundity, her words. Here she recites the poem. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time I've been climbing on and reaching landings and turning corners, and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you sit down on them steps because you find it's kind of hard. Don't you stop now, for I still going, honey, I still climbing. And for me, life ain't been no crystal stair. With this with this determination, with this faith, we will be able to create new homes, new communities, new cities, a new nation, and yeah, a new world, which we all desperately need. Here we see, in the wake of King's death, Coretta Scott King is able to take up her own concerns. Not that the concerns of King were not her own concerns, but she's able to take a different approach on this particular agenda, right? And I think that there's something important. I don't necessarily believe that welfare in this country will solve all of our problems, but I do think within the particular context of the Poor People's Campaign as it was growing at the time, and this particular reflection on what it means to think about how the problem of war is not only a problem of international concern, but that the way we understand war abroad directly impacts us at home. And for her to be able to link it to the particular ways that women and children experience poverty in this nation, I think it's something that we have to pay particular attention to, right? And it's something that we, continue to struggle with. And I don't think Coretta is making any argument that men are not suffering in any kind of way, but I do think that there is an important rhetorical turn that she's making here to try to call on women, particularly in this time, right, in the late 1960s, to think about what is the role that women particularly have to play. And also not just what is the role that women have to play in our struggles, but then what is the particular way that the forms of violence and poverty that are meted upon women exist in this country at the time. And so I think one of the most important things to take away from what we begin to see the work of the civil rights movement, the ways that the work of the civil rights movement begins to shift in the wake of King's assassination is towards, I think, this thinking the international and the domestic together, thinking about the sort of global nature of poverty, right? And I think in spite of the sort of rhetorical strategies that talk about the richness of the United States, to call out the hypocrisy of what it means to be poor in a country that is so rich. And then to also later make the connections about why this country is rich in that particular way is something that is the work that we continue to do today. And I think it is a profound part of not only King, but Coretta Scott King's legacies. And I think that, again, this segment, She Gathered Me, was initially conceived as a way to think about the relationships between women and particularly the sort of political understandings of love. And I think when we think about the nature of care and what it means to be able to take care of ourselves and our people, and this demand for guaranteed income, right, is about a demand for humanity and a demand to be able to live a particular kind of humane and dignified life. And that is where I will leave you all today, with the legacy of Coretta Scott King.
All right, y'all. So for my rant today, I tweeted about this, but I just want to state for the record, everything is not the fucking new Jim Crow. I am so tired of these lazy ass analogies. Forms of oppression, exploitation, super exploitation, repression, and marginalization are their own things. We don't need these lazy analogies that extrapolate from the past and impose a particular regime on the future to understand what the fuck is happening. We can talk about mass incarceration as mass incarceration. We could talk about the current attack on voting rights as the current attack on voting rights, right? Disenfranchisement is disenfranchisement. Oppression is not reducible to any one regime, right? So Jim Crow doesn't have to be our overarching reference point, just like slavery doesn't have to be our overarching reference point. And to point that out doesn't mean that these things are not important, that they have not fundamentally shaped the ways that you as Blacks have existed and also sort of the ways that we've struggled. The point is that stop fucking calling everything a lynching. Stop calling everything the new Jim Crow. Stop calling everything things that might be familiar, but that can obfuscate, that can distort, that can even mischaracterize as much as they illuminate, right? So like, please, y'all, study. And here is the upshot. Let me just end on this point. Y'all want to call everything the new Jim Crow, except for Jim Crow Joe Biden. Y'all still cha-cha sliding to vote for this man. So, as always, this is simply a call to do better. Call shit what it is, not what it's not, okay? Thank you.
All right, so we are back for part 2 of season 2, and we have a wonderful lineup. We have so many people that have already confirmed. So as the season continues, you will see, we will have Nyasha Mboti of South Africa. He's one of the, he's the founder of Apartheid Studies. We have a special conversation on Black radical women that's going to feature co-host of the Groundings podcast, Devin Darian. We have Stephanie Evans coming on to talk about her book, Black Women's Yoga History. And then last but not least, we have Monique Badesi to come on to talk about her new book, John Kingdom. And we will have a special co-host, friend of the show, Eric Keynes, also known as Ricky Ryan in the chat. So we have so much to look forward to this season. So thanks for rocking with us as always.
Yes, yes. We also have Yannick Marshall coming back. We had him on for a Talk Black segment back in our BPM days. And then we also have Femi Taiwo talking about his book on reparations. And also we might loop in his stuff on elite capture. Mm-hmm.
And our first regular episode back that's not just featuring us, we have Derica Purnell coming on to talk about her new book, Becoming Abolitionist.
All right, y'all. So we have a whole bunch of great stuff coming up for you. But before we get out of here, I wouldn't be me if I didn't end this MLK themed episode without a bunch of readings from and by MLK. So the first one is All Labor Has Dignity, which is a collection of MLK's writings on labor. There is To the Promised Land, Martin Luther King and the Fight for Economic Justice. And then there is Going Down to Jericho Road, the Memphis Strike, Martin Luther King's last campaign. And all of these are by Michael K. Honey, who is one of the, I think, a leading King scholar. There's also this book is really good, y'all. It's called Prophets of Discontent, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Critique of Racial Capitalism. So check this guy out. My all-time favorite collection of King writings is this one, The Radical King, which was edited by Cornel West. And then, so what we were quoting from earlier is this, Why We Can't Wait, which is some of the, some of King's earlier thought. That's not my favorite era of King, but it's, it's worthwhile. And then I wanted to also lift up this book, Beacons of Defense, Armed Resistance and the Civil Rights Movement, to again, avoid reducing MLK to MLK. Like MLK was part of a network, part of organizations, part of a whole sort of era and epoch of movement and struggle. So with that in mind, also this biography of Coretta Scott King. I don't know if there are any other biographies of her. This one is a lot about King. There's a lot about King in here, although it's about Coretta. So we need a new biography that's really about Coretta and her activism, as Layla lifted up in She Gathered Me. And then finally, Climbing Jacob's Ladder, the Black Freedom Movement writings of Jack O'Dell. Jack O'Dell was an important comrade and advisor of King. And so it's important to, again, recognize that King was part of a network, that, King was a person because of people. And so check out those readings, y'all, and also drop whatever your sort of favorite King or civil rights readings are in the chat.
And that's our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you were here with us. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Dr. Brown here with my girl, Dr. CBS. And thanks as always to Two Black in the back. And we're signing off.
Ow!